looks at families and the benefits that families can have, some protective factors that families provide. And so it kind of takes the psychology and sociology and mixes them together and just talks about how it benefits the family. And so one of the things that I have the opportunity, I'm also a parent of 2 children. I've got a 9-year-old daughter who will be 10, and she just reminded me, in 17 days, Dad. So in 17 days, she's going to be the big 1-0. And I have a son who is 7 years old. And we love living in Kentucky. We're relatively new to the state. And so we come with all of our baggage, and I've learned so much through the time that I've been here. And so one of the things that I have the opportunity to do in my role is to share about parenting practices. And the way I do that is the way that the university does that, really, is that we use science-based evidence, or what we call best practices. And the way best practices are established is through trying a whole lot of them and finding out what works and what doesn't work. And so when we use that term best practice, one of the things that the Extension Office offers is education that is science-based, that we do a lot of research. And so we try to provide the best information that has evidence behind it for those that can hear that and then try it a little bit. And so before I get in there are 3 things that I feel are foundational to who I am and what I'm about. And so I want to provide that in the role that I play here. And I think it'll help you this evening hear and understand the things that I'm sharing. And the first thing is that there's more than one way to raise a great child. And I need to say that because I'm going to be sharing with you ways that have been best practices that are proved through evidence. But I also want you to know that there's more than one way. And so while I might offer one way, I want you to know it might not be the only way. And so what I don't want people hearing me say is that this is the only way you can discipline your child, or this is the only way to respond in this certain event. The second part that I think is key foundation is that you're the expert on your child. I'm not here to tell any parent about their child because I think that would be foolish. Your child, you know your child better than I do. That is true. I can talk about children in general, but when I think about my own children, what works for one child, what works for my daughter, does not always work for my son. And so when I offer information, a best practice, I want you to hear that as this is evidence, but you may know in your mind, this wouldn't work for my son or this wouldn't work for my daughter. But what I want to caution you on, after saying that, I want to provide a cautionary statement, and that is this. I know that my son and my daughter both tell me, Dad, I don't like that. And I would tell them, how do you know you don't like that if you've never tried it? And so if I mention something tonight, if I share some tips or some suggestions or strategies on how to discipline a child, it may be a gut response for you, or quick, a knee-jerk reaction to say, that won't work with my child. But I want to provide the same love and care that I do for my children and say, don't tell me you don't like it or it doesn't work until you've at least tried it. So if you hear something tonight, know that it's evidence-based. Know that I believe you, that there's more than one way to do this. I believe you're the expert on your child. And then the final thing is that we in Extension are educators. It's what we do. And so we have information for you whenever you need it. So my job is not to smash you with a whole bunch of information tonight. I just want to present some things that I found to be very useful that I hope will be also useful in your families. And so we're going to go ahead and kick this thing off. I've titled it Discipline, what it is, what it's not, and how to be effective, right? So how can we do this effectively? What you can expect tonight is that I'm going to define discipline. I'll talk about some of the understanding the purpose of discipline, like why is it that we do what we do. I'll identify some barriers that keep us from being effective in discipline, and you may very well relate to these barriers. I want you to know that I'm going to be very honest about sharing some of my own pitfalls and some of the mistakes that I've made and how I've learned from that. And then also, we're going to talk about child development and the important role that child development plays in being able to effectively discipline our children. We have to know where they are developmentally. And so we'll touch on that. And then we're going to talk about some positive strategies, some things that I think that science says, again, not just my thoughts, but what science has proven, these are effective strategies to use. And so I'm going to offer those to you. It won't answer every question you have. And I kind of hope to leave you that way. I hope to leave you a little hungry, because there's a lot of things that we do in Extension as far as curriculum and programs that we run that provide more information on said topics. So even tonight, if you're thinking, okay, this is great, but I don't have more questions about child development, David, I really want to work on finances, or I really have some questions about substance use or misuse, or about relationship issues. All of those things are issues, or how to be healthy in our home, or healthy nutrition. Those are all topics that we cover in Extension. And so I want to put that out there and say we offer free education if you so desire, and if you find yourself asking questions. So we're going to jump in. What's discipline? What I like to do if we were in a forum where we were face to face, I like to ask that question and just have the audience give me some information. Because what I typically find is that the word discipline often is synonymous with terms such as punishment, or things that are negative in the way in which we treat our children, or the way that we would maybe subtract something from their life. And so I think it's important that we understand the purpose and what discipline is. It's an interactive approach. What that means is that interaction, it's between more than one person, and it takes it takes energy. It's active. I'm doing something. The point of me doing something is to produce contributing members of society. Because after all, if you're like me, I love my children, but at some point, I'm looking forward to them growing up and moving out of the house and being productive in the world. And in order to do that, people have to like them, right? Somebody's got to like them if they want to marry them. And so the whole part of disciplining is to help our children fit into the world around us. And we do that through imparting knowledge. If you were to look at the root word of discipline, it's disciplinia. And a lot of what people say is that is the act of teaching, to teach, to impart skill and knowledge. And so if we begin to think of discipline as more of a teaching, guiding, and less of a forced obedience, we're probably more along the lines of what the intention is, and we'll be more successful in how we do it. Make no mistake, teaching and discipline is extremely time-consuming, and it requires an extreme amount of energy. And so if anybody you see is parenting and they seem to have it all under control and they're not exerting a lot of energy, my thought to you and my statement to them would be, you're probably not doing it. And if you are, you're probably not doing it well, because it does require a lot of us. Because as I mentioned, my two children are different. And so it requires me to adjust the way that I discipline one child to the other. And we'll get into that as we start to unfold. But what's the purpose? So what's the point of discipline? If I know that it's to teach and impart skill, if I know that I want my children to someday be a contributing member to society and go fit in somewhere in the world, how does that happen? What's the purpose of this? And it's threefold. We want our children to be able to organize themselves. We don't need to be the one organizing them all the time. We want them to be able to do that themselves. We want them to internalize rules, because rules are everywhere. Rules start in our home, but they expound outside. There's rules to riding bicycles. There's rules to go into the grocery store. There's rules to go into any line of work that you have it. There are rules that bind those. And so we need our children to know that rules start here and they end nowhere. There are rules everywhere in society. And then the last piece would be to acquire appropriate behavior and patterns. We want them, again, to be successful in society. And so our discipline and the purpose of our discipline is to help them acquire really good habits and behaviors in the way that they encounter others in their day-to-day activities. So what it's not? Well, we know it's not humiliation. There are a lot of things that I feel like the way that we respond and the way that we act when our children act, or react when our children act, bring about some negative qualities. my intention to help my child is not ever going to be through the use of humiliation. It's not going to be through verbal abuse or shouting or name calling. It's not through threatening. It's not this do as I say, not as I do. And when I think about what it's not, and if I were honest, I would ask you, I would say, hey, what do you think is happening here? What happens if you were to look at this slide and you were to say, okay, humiliation, verbal abuse, shouting, name calling, threatening. What do you think is going on with the parent at this point? I think what I would hear a lot of you tell me is that they're losing their mind, right? They're losing ground. They're feeling angry. They're feeling frustrated. They're feeling as if they're out of resources. I feel this way. I get this way many times in a month. I might get this way many times in a week, depending on it. Right now, with COVID, I would say a lot of us probably stay around this area of feeling frustrated, overwhelmed, just feeling pressure, parental pressure. And so the reason we want to know what it's not is so that we can remind ourselves when we start slipping there that we say, hey, wait a minute, I'm threatening. You better or else. When I use that, I'm scrapping, right? I am stretching for things to say to my children. So we need to know that this isn't helpful. And we can do more of that. But tonight, I think it's simple to say, this is what discipline is not. So what does it look like when discipline is in action? What's a disciplined individual look like? That can help us a lot of times determine what it is we're aiming for. So I want you to think about this. A disciplined person is someone who postpones pleasure. Another way of saying that is that we are able to, it just slipped my mind too. Postpone pleasure. It's being considerate of the needs of others. We're going to be assertive without being aggressive or hostile. And we can tolerate discomfort when necessary. Delayed gratification. That was it. I knew if I would just go on, it would come. Postponed pleasure is the same thing we call delayed gratification. Something we try to instill in our children. But if you take all of that and we say, this is what I'm expecting my child to be, if I'm going to put it in my own context, my 7-year-old, I'm expecting my 7-year-old to be able to postpone pleasure, to consider the needs of others, maybe beyond their own, to be assertive without being aggressive or hostile, and to be able to tolerate discomfort when necessary. What I would be saying is that rarely do I ever find my children in this state throughout any given day. But if I was honest, I would say I'm probably not in this state many times throughout a week. The point here is that if we want to discipline can only happen from a place of discipline. I can't discipline my child without me, myself first, having those disciplined characteristics. So if I'm losing my mind, if I go back to that humiliation, right? If I go back to that yelling and name calling, when my children upset me, my son he's got a voice like his father. It's loud, it's booming. He uses it often. It oftentimes sounds like screaming to me. And so that's hard for me. And I'll tell him, Elijah, we're not going to yell. And he'll go on, he'll start getting loud again. Elijah, I don't want to yell. By the third or fourth time I tell him this, I'm starting to raise my voice. I'm getting mad. And there's been more than one occasion where he would say, but Dad, you're yelling at me. I'm yelling at him to stop yelling. And he's recognizing the fact that I can't even do that. Like, Dad, you're not even disciplined. So I think what we need to know is that what we ask of our children is oftentimes very difficult for ourselves to do. And so having a compassionate, but also really beginning with that respectful thing. I need to be respect, right? This effective discipline has the foundation of respect that has to resonate from that situation. I can't ask my child to do something that I myself am unable to do. So what are some of the things that keep us from effective discipline? The most common is inconsistency. When we think about being inconsistent, there's a lot of ways that we're inconsistent. What I hear from parents is, well, they go to their grandparents and their grandparents allow this, or they go to their mom's house, or they go to their dad's house, or they go to you fill in the blank, their best friend's house or their aunt's house or their uncle's house, and they get to stay up late. They allow them to do this. We come home, we don't allow them to do that. The same thing happens inside our home. Inconsistency from day to day. I find that I have fallen victim to being inconsistent in my own parenting styles. There are times where one day, feeling good, feeling great, I say, yeah, okay, you can do that today. Or I let it slide. Elijah's yelling. I'm not going to be upset about it today. I'm going to let it go. The next day, I'm short on temper, and I come after him. I put spanking under here because spanking oftentimes is one of those inconsistent behaviors. It's one of those things that children get very confused about because it's not all the time. It's not consistent for the most part. Or they're using it all the time. They're saying, I'm just getting hit all the time. But inconsistency, spanking, oftentimes children aren't really aware. There are a lot of studies, qualitative studies that talk to children about being spanked by their parent. And many of them do not understand at the point of being spanked why they're being spanked. They just feel like dad's mad or mom's mad. So inconsistencies, that's a big barrier to effective discipline. Parenting styles. All right, this might be something you're aware of or you're not aware of. They say there's 4, and you say, well, David, your slide only shows 3. You're right. There's one of them that I don't really typically put up there because it's not parenting. It's the absent parent, right? It's the one that's not around. And so to me, that's not parenting really much at all. But you have authoritarian. Think of it this way. Authoritarian, the barbarian, right? The one that is like my father was, and I think like a lot of other military men are. I'm ex-military, so I'm a veteran. So that's one of the things that I struggle with. But this is someone who has strict rules. They're very one-way communication, my way or the highway. They have high expectations, very rigid, not flexible in their boundaries or in their limited flexibility, kind of overall limited flexibility. And the focus is oftentimes on obedience. You do as I say, right? I tell you to do this. I say jump, you say how high. That's the way it rolls. That's the authoritarian style. The authoritative style, on the other hand, this is kind of like the perfect parent, right? This is someone who's reasonable, who's nurturing, very clear expectations, frequent communication. They allow children to decide for themselves rather than giving the directions. So they allow that child autonomy. And it's not that they allow that child to do anything they want, but they allow them to have some of that autonomy. And then the last here is permissive. This is someone you might hear a parent might say, well, she's my daughter, but really we're best friends. This is a child who they get anything that they want. They do what they want. This parent offers limited guidance or direction. They are more like a friend than a parent. They're warm and nurturing, but they have minimal expectations. So they don't require much of their children. This child is often a child who's not liked by many people because they're somewhat of kind of a bratty child. Now, when you look at these parenting styles, it's easy to kind of say, oh, well, I'm probably the one in the middle. Each and of themselves are not necessarily all bad. Parenting styles themselves are not bad. They're good. Oftentimes, the barriers to effective discipline happens when the parents have different parenting styles. Now, being different's not bad, but let's just imagine this together, and I bet you'll figure this out real quick. If I'm a permissive parent and I have a spouse who is an authoritarian parent, the authoritarian parent sees that the permissive parent is a little too lax. So what do? They ratchet up a little bit. Like, well, okay, so mom's super light or dad's super light, so I'm gonna have to kind of make up where dad lets loose or where mom's falling short. I'm gonna kind of fill in that gap. Well, so what's the other parent do? They do the same. They go the other direction. They go the polar opposite. So they're saying, well, I'm gonna ease up. Dad is way too hard on you, so I'm gonna give you the green light. This, as you can see, begins to kind of get into this the dog is chasing his tail and kind of runs in a circle. It can be very difficult. And at times, again, being different is not necessarily bad. It's the extent to which you're different. So parenting styles and communication between parents are oftentimes a barrier to that effective parent or that effective discipline. One of the things that's neat, and I'm going to plug in some of the extension work. This is something that we work on with parents. There's curriculums that we use. One's called Parenting a Second Time Around. There's also some nurturing parenting that gets into these parenting styles, gives you an opportunity to find out which one you are, and then helps you to be able to adjust if you find that it's adjustable. One, what you do is you find out how you respond to things, and then you begin to wonder, is this really the way that I want to respond? Or is my response causing the behavior that I really want? And a lot of times we find that those questions aren't as easy as we thought to answer, and we may not find the answer that we really were hoping or thought that we were getting. And so it can cause some adjustment, some need for adjustment in parenting styles. And so there's an opportunity for you to learn more about this if this is something you really want to seek and look into and adjust. The third barrier is this unrealistic expectation. What becomes unrealistic has to do around the child's temperament, developmental stage, and a cognitive ability. So our expectations should match the child temperament. I'm going to tell you the difference between my two children with just one short story. It wasn't this summer, it was last summer. We were going to go to the pool. And both of my children love swimming. It's all about it. It was a nice hot summer day. You know the ones that are here in Kentucky, you know how they get. Super hot. We were excited. We loaded up into the car. We were driving down the block to go to the pool. And when we pulled up, lightning struck, and they closed the gates to the pool. I turned to my kids. I said, hey, sorry. My son says, Dad, you're a liar. I hate you. My daughter said, Dad, I'm just glad we got to ride in the car together. That is a true story, and it couldn't exemplify the drastic difference in temperament between my two children. Now, temperament, like personality, temperament is something we're born with. That's genetic. That's not anything Dad's going to spank out of his son. That is something that we are born with, that we have to deal with. And so for me to expect my son to respond the same way that my daughter does is unrealistic, because I have to factor in their temperament. He's never going to receive that kind of information the same way she does. Why? Because he's overly sensitive to those type of topics. When disappointment, he's very disappointed. My daughter handles that much better. The developmental stage, that's another one. I'll go ahead and share a story with you. I was going to share it on the next slide, but it doesn't really matter. You'll still get the story, and we'll still make the same points. When I was at I took my son who was 5 years old. We decided to go to the pediatric. We had to go see the pediatrician because it was his 5-year checkup. So we get there. We're in the waiting room. I'm a puzzle fan, so we started working a puzzle together. There's another little child, probably around the age, I would say 2, give or take a few months on either, maybe 6 months on either end. Maybe it's 1.5 years, maybe it's 2.5. Child was sitting on the floor playing with a bunch of blocks. The parent was sitting behind the child on the phone. Pretty standard in a waiting room kind of thing. As we're going on and making our puzzle, the child decides they want to interact with their child. And so they said, hand me a blue block. The child is there on the floor, and they picks up the block right next to him, hands the block up. It's a yellow block. The parent says, no, I said hand me the blue block. The child, again, reaches down, pulls up a block. It's red. At this point, the parent begins to get verbally upset. Says to the child, no, I said the blue block, it's on your right. Now, if I was sitting with you all in face to face, I would ask you, what's wrong with the scenario? And I would love to hear everybody's talk, everybody's feedback. But where we would rest would be here. That 2-year-old doesn't know colors and certainly doesn't know direction. What happened in that situation is so common to what I'm talking about today. And that's because we're not aware developmentally where our children should be, our expectation is beyond realistic. We're asking that child to do things that they're not capable of doing. This happens all the time. I'll give you another example in a minute. But what was happening in that situation was that parent was feeling disrespected. They weren't feeling as if they were getting obeyed, right? This parent was asking that child to protect. That child had no idea what that parent was asking. It was doing its best to provide whatever it was that the parent was asking without fully understanding what it was that was being asked of them. That, again, happens all the time. Cognitive ability is what we're talking about, the ability to solve problems, where we are fundamentally as our knowledge base. That is because we have to understand those. If we don't put those into practice, we will end up on unrealistic expectations, and we will never get the discipline, the effective discipline that we're looking to get. The behavior change will not happen because of our lack of knowledge about what's happening. The last thing on this slide that I'll mention is trauma. And I want to mention it briefly. When trauma takes place, and trauma, this could be a child who's experienced trauma, this could be an adult that's experienced trauma. If both are in a family, then it really needs to be addressed in a very fundamental way. And one of the ways that we can do that is understand what's happening in our brains when trauma takes place. We revert to a very small, localized, smallest portion of our brain called the reptilian brain. And what happens is that that fight, flight, or freeze, that whole shutdown, oh my gosh, it's an emergency. We're no longer in executive functioning. We're no longer processing logically. And so a lot of things can take place that don't make it. A lot of requests can be stated to a child that don't make it into the receptive part of the brain that controls that area. And so understanding trauma, understanding if we have children that have been traumatized or have a background of trauma, there's special things that we need to consider when it comes to giving just basic directives and how to understand when a child is triggered from a traumatic event, what kind of takes place in that child's mind. And if that's something that interests you more, there's more information on that. I won't spend much more time on it this evening other than saying it's a barrier to effective discipline. And if you have children or you yourself have had trauma in the past, exploring that a little bit more can help you a lot be much more effective in your parenting. So what can we do? If you're like me, I've run into these situations that say, God, there's got to be a better way. What in the world, David? Why do I keep running into the same roadblocks when I'm trying to get my children to change their behavior? Again, the first thing we can do is get a better understanding of child development. As a young man, I knew very little about this. When my wife and I were married early on, my sister had just had a son. I had not had children yet. I was still young. I just got out of the Army. So I had not ventured into my master's or my doctoral degree. So I was young Joe. And I was excited because at Christmas, I was going to get to chase my nephew around the Christmas tree. Well, he was one. And my daughter looked at me, and she said, my wife looked at me and said, do you think you're going to chase him around the Christmas tree? He's 1 year old. He can't even walk. To me, as a young man, that never even registered. Had no idea about that until I began getting educated in this field. And so I share that because I think that's common, that there are a lot of things that we think are happening in a child that just aren't happening. And so when we think about how a child develops, we know that there's physical and motor development. And what we're talking about there are big muscles. We're talking about how we move the body, development of the body. Cognitive development is what's referred to. It's referred to as cognitive development, but what they're talking about is the ability to solve problems. Social and emotional development, how a child gets along with other people, as well as how they feel and how they're going to get along with you and learn to relate with you. Communication, language development. Of course, we're talking about verbal and nonverbal communication. Now, one thing to recognize here is when I talk about development, one of the things, a lot of development specialists look at these spans of time of when a child develops. Most of those spans are 6 months, sometimes to 18 months, almost 2 years, depending on what the developmental stage is. And what I mean by that is that no two children develop the same way. One of the problems that happens with parents is that they'll often say to a child, well, they knew what the consequence was for that behavior. Therefore, they knew they shouldn't have done it. So I'm going to punish this child. The problem with that is a lot of times we're expecting that everything is developing at the same time. And that's not the way it happens. So a child may be cognitively be able to tell you, hey, so if I ask my son, hey, buddy, I told you not to take milk into the living room. You brought milk in here. What's the problem? Or how should I discipline you? Well, what happens when you do that? Well, you send me to my room. Okay, exactly. Then go to your room. Why do I do that? Because in my mind, he knew what he shouldn't have done, and he knew what was going to happen if he did do it. Therefore, he should know not to do it. In that logic, what I fail to understand and what I fail to take into consideration is the fact that my son and any child at this age is not able to control their impulses like you and I are. And let's be fair, some adults we know can't control their impulses either. So it doesn't necessarily mean how old you get that you can do that. The problem is with young children, that impulse control is so strong and is so weak, I guess. They're not able to control their impulses, that even though they have the cognitive ability to say, hey, I know what the consequence of this action is, I just can't do it. And if I continue to punish that child, I'm developmentally wrong. I am outside. I have unrealistic expectations. That child is not able to conduct the behavior that I'm asking them to conduct. Therefore, if I'm making that the rule, then I've missed. Okay, so if I'm asking them to not do something and then they do it, I'm mad at them. But the reality is I shouldn't have asked them to do it because they couldn't do it to begin with. Hopefully that was not as confusing as it may have sounded. So what are some ways that we can be effective? How can we be effective? How can we help our children get to the desired behaviors that we want? Well, the biggest set of research, the strongest set of research across the board, and this has been for decades, has talked about providing a safe and warm environment. And when I mean warm, I don't necessarily mean heat, although that is helpful. I mean like a warmed heart, a kindness, a softness that comes like you would think with a mother. And here is a father telling you these things. Like it comes with this positive language use and a tone. You know what's, my wife tells me oftentimes, David, it's not what you say, it's the way in which you say it. It's that tone of voice that you take. I get frustrated. My language becomes frustrated. My tone becomes firm. I begin to respond to my children in a way that becomes very demanding and, again, very, very difficult for them to hear and to understand. And as a matter of fact, my son will often say, Dad, why are you yelling at me? And I'll say, I'm not yelling. I'm not yelling. And he said, but it sounds like yelling to me. And so that's good for me to know, because when I do that, when my tone begins to change, I understand it's time for me to walk away. That's, for me, it's a moment for me to acknowledge when is a time for me to call a timeout and walk away. And it's when that tone begins to change in that positive language. And so one of the things, I'll give you for instance, you all might be able to relate to this. In COVID, everything I do, you can see my house is in the background. I'm working from home. My son was in here earlier because I'm in the room where they're supposed to take their shoes off, and he had forgotten to do so. And so he was crawling behind me here and he's putting his shoes down. One of the things that happens is they'll come in and they'll talk to me when I'm on a call, and I'll be doing this number. If you can see this, and I'll be like, shh, hey, get away. Stop doing that. Or giving the cutthroat sign. I could use my language a little better than that. To them, that feels like I'm yelling at them. One of the things that I could say to them would be maybe just that, hey, instead of saying, shh, go away, I could say, hey, buddy, give me 10 minutes and we'll talk about that. But I can't do that right now. And I know in some ways you're like that sounds like an awful lot of an awful lot of oh gosh, I'm losing the word, self-control, right? Like, come on, that's a lot of discipline, right? Again, I'm trying to discipline my son. I need to show them that I too am disciplined and not losing my mind. This other one is provide attention. A lot of the times when children act up, it's because they're seeking attention. And so by providing attention and doing so at this next point with regular times and patterns of activities, this can oftentimes provide that consistency that will reduce those outbursts, will reduce that attention-seeking behavior a lot of times, which can be the shenanigans or the behaviors that are just repetitive and get on our nerves, right? Because they're trying to get that attention from you. So if we can provide that attention, a lot of times we can reduce, certainly as they get older, we can reduce the need to have to discipline for unwanted behaviors. That warm tone and positive tone too, a lot of times that'll take children down to the point to where they can have more of a conversation. They don't get explosive when we say no, or we provide the feedback that they need, or they don't want to hear. A lot of times, if we do it in a positive way, in a kind tone, there's less reaction. So yes, positive clarity and consistency. And again, just being clear. For me, not to say, don't talk to me that way. Instead, what I could say is, speak to me respectfully. I need you to be respectful. Again, I'm being much more clear about what I want. I'm not just being explosive. My tone and positive language there are going to help with that clarity and consistency. And then responding to similar behavioral situations. And what I mean by that is, I had spoken about this earlier. My children are very different. When my daughter, because she's the one that's like, hey, Dad, I'm just glad we got to spend time together when the pool didn't work out. But when she messes up, I seem to have a lot more grace because her temperament is oftentimes very easygoing, very adaptive. And so for me, when I respond to her maybe undesirable behavior, my consequence might be a lot less. Or maybe the way I respond is much kinder than when my son, who does the very same behavior, may get something different. So again, the need for consistency. And children are very aware of that. They can tell you, oh, why do you always let so-and-so get away with this? And you know how that is. If you have more than one child, you've heard that before for sure. And so trying to be responding similar behavioral situations, trying to stay consistent. And then the last thing here is to use appropriate boundaries. When I talk about boundaries, this is obviously something that is across the lifespan. What I set up for my young children is not the same thing I'll set up for a teenage child. So flexibility is the name of the game. Be the willow. That's what I oftentimes tell my boss, to be a willow, because the willows don't break, right? They bend but don't break. And it's just trying to be flexible. And especially now in COVID, flexibility has been the name of the game. We had some very strict rules in our house around screens and screen time and screen use. Since COVID, those have become very lax because everything requires a screen, everything. And so my children are on screens all the time. And so flexibility is the name of the game. I'm also going to remind you of that authoritative parent, not the authoritarian, the barbarian. The authoritarian, the barbarian was not flexible, right? So having flexibility is really key. Presenting options is also a key. For my son, now I'm going to give you a story. My son, when we were presenting options, he's what we would call a strong-willed child, right? Someone who likes to press against the gate, who likes to hit those boundaries. And boundaries are good because that's what happens. If I was in front of you right now, I would call a couple people to put their hands up against my hands. And what I do in this scenario is I slightly push against you. And immediately what I find, not telling anybody what I'm doing, immediately you start to push back. Immediately. Try that with someone. Just put your hands up and say, let me try something with you. They won't know what you're doing. Put your hands on their hands and sllightly but firmly begin to apply pressure and see what happens. See what that other person does. I promise you, they'll push you back. The reason I share that with parents is because that is the natural response we all have. When I put up a boundary, when I start to press on you, you immediately start to press on me. It's that survival thing. It's this idea that I don't want people pressing on me. I don't want you pushing your boundaries on me. I don't want you telling me that I've got to go only this far. That's an innate human instinct. So our children are naturally going to press up against us. When we put a boundary on them, hey, let them roll all up on that thing, right? Cattle do the same thing. They bang into it. You know, they do the electric wire, and after time, you don't even have to electrify it anymore because they won't go to it, right? You all know this if you've seen those the invisible dog collars and all that stuff. But they no longer have to know. Once they know where that boundary is, they're able to stay within inside that boundary. But it's the first initial pieces that they oftentimes push against. Presenting options is another way of keeping those boundaries there. For instance, my wife, my son, my daughter, we were all at the grocery store. We're leaving the grocery store, and my rule is that we have got to hold hands in the parking lot. You've got to hold my hand. We're going to link up, and we're going to walk through the parking lot because we don't know what's happening, and I don't want anybody getting hurt. Well, my son was acting as he does. He likes to just say no and, do his own thing. And so I said, hey, buddy, link up. And I snatched his hand. I grabbed his hand. My wife is in front of me. My daughter's with my other hand. And we walk. And as soon as we hit those doors and they open up, my son dips. He yanks his hand down. He dips his shoulder and he runs, right? I'm about to lose my mind. I'm about to get him, right? I'm going to yell out at him like, oh, what are you doing? He ran up and he grabbed my wife's hand. And I thought to myself, that was a good call. He doesn't have to hold my hand. He has to hold a hand. The point of it is one of the things that we need to think when we make our boundaries, when we're creating our rules within our house and what our kids can and can't do, one of the things we need to keep in mind, and I want you to recite this to yourself, is it for my convenience or is it for my child's safety? A lot of times what we'll find, and what I find with parents, again, I've been a victim of this, is that we create rules around our convenience. My daughter wanted to go spend the night at her friend's house. Well, she didn't want to spend the night. She's too young to spend the night, so she was going to go over there till 9:30, and then she was going to come home. I did not want that to happen because I didn't want to have to go get her at 9:30. And my wife reminded me of that. She said, hey, wait a minute, David. Are you doing that because of her safety, or are you doing that out of your convenience? And I was honest with myself and said, I'm so doing that out of my convenience. And so that helped me change that. It helped me be flexible. It helped my daughter get what she really needed, which was time with a friend. So the last thing here is include the child in the decision-making process. This is fun, if for no other reason, just for experimental purposes. If you all haven't asked your kids, especially young kids, to help you come up with consequences of what happens when these rules are broken, or if someone doesn't follow the rules, how are we going to handle that? What you'll find, as what I've found, and I think many, many parents do, is children are oftentimes very harsh on themselves as far as it comes to boundaries, right, and consequences. I've asked my at the time 6-year-old and 8-year-old what we were going to do if someone was not going to go to bed on time. What was going to happen? My son, he was like, I don't think we should eat for 2 days. And I thought, it's a little harsh, guy. It's a little harsh. We'll just go for a meal. No, I'm just kidding. Don't take food away from kids. I was teasing. That's a joke. It's not. Kids are oftentimes much more harsh on them about the way to do, or how to have their consequences when it comes up to them. So think about how we're going to use boundaries and use them appropriately. Now, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. gone a little faster than we thought it was going to go. But let's do this. Let's go ahead and wrap up. I want you to think about some things before we close it up. And that's, what is my parenting style? How do I parent? Does it work? Does it work with my spouses? What's my spouse's parenting style? Are those working? Are my expectations for my children realistic? Are they clear? Is my child getting what he and she needs? I think that's important that we think about what is my child getting? What are they not getting? Are there safety issues? Because if there are, then that's the way we need to address it. And then what do I need? As a parent, you can only pour out what's in the cup. And so if you're not full up, if you don't have what you need, then maybe understanding what do I need to be able to make that list. And then do I need more information? Because if you need more information, I think Extension can help. I think Extension can help you answer all of the questions that I have right here. And so I'm going to encourage you to seek out the Extension office. If you haven't, I know Kenna welcomed herself and introduced herself to several of you. If you don't know her, she is one of the finest agents in the state, and I say that unashamedly. I'm not blowing smoke. She's amazing at her job. She does great work. She's got some amazing curriculums in education that's all free. If you don't know about Extension, please look into it. We're a great resource. And we're not far from you. We're in every county. So even if you're visiting from another county, we have an Extension office in every county.